All right, so today we are going to continue the button versus the big blind, and we're going to focus more on the big blind side of things. Yesterday we did the button side of things, and we're going to pull that up. We're going to pull up the aggregated reports before looking into the flop play, and we're going to look at the pre-flop stuff as well. So we have button raise. We had a big blind call as one of the nodes. We're not going to look at 3-bets yet. So we're just going to look at the calling range of the big blind and the folding range, right? Because that's what's going to be important. Calling here, you'll see the bottom parts of our range against the button. Let's see if we're on the right solution here. Yes, okay. We're on the right solution. So the calling range for the big blind is going to look like this. King 8 offsuit is the bottom of our range, along with ace 6 offsuit, ace 4 offsuit, 10 8, 9 8, 8 7, 7 6, 3 2 suited, and even 8 4 suited, low frequency, 10 4, 10 5. These are all combos that are mixing a fold or call. As a call from the big blind. So surprisingly, Queen 9 is folding sometimes. That's surprising to me, especially since it's a hand that's 3-betting. Same thing with Jack 9. I would really never notice that. But it does make sense because I am always kind of like unsure of what to do with those hands when I get dealt them in the big blind versus the button. So I think that's everything for the mix of folds and calls, right? So remembering the bottom of your call range here, 7-6 offsuit is a call at a mix, and it looks like, what is the frequency? 27%. So about a quarter of the time. Same thing with 8-7, 9-8's a third of the time, 10-8 about a third of the time, King 8 about a third of the time, ace 6 third. So you could probably simplify all of these like threshold hands to close to a third of the time or a quarter of the time. And then just pure fold them if you feel like, you know, you're up against a really tough player, or, you know, you're playing Zoom and you don't think you're maximizing the EV of these hands yet, and you just want to move to the next hand. I generally recommend playing it and getting used to playing it. I think it's just going to be better overall. Let's put my cam back over here, shall we? Or does that block too much? Yeah, that probably blocks too much of the matrix there. Also forgot to pop out my chat. There we go. So sorry if I didn't respond to any chat so far. All right. So yeah, so looking at the big blind calling range, I've been over folding the big blind, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing because, like I said, it's really difficult to realize the equity of these in different hands. You have to play them very well post-flop. But that's something I'm going to work on. So looking at the call range, 7-6, 8-7, 9-8, 10-8, King 8, Ace 4, 10-3, 10-4, 10-5, 9-5. We could probably simplify to just not playing 8-4, but once in a while we can call it, especially if it's a recreational player. Okay. So once we get to the call portion, we can then, we've looked at the leading, right? Let me open up my notes really quick. We've looked at the leading range from the big blind already. We know that it's a very like low card heavy range, like 6 high, 7 high, 8 high. So Yeah. Button versus big blind single raise pot. Let's make this bigger. There we go. So we looked at big blind leading. We looked at button C betting. And then now we're looking at big blind versus button C bet. So this is the next node to look at. And we'll start off. So the tough thing about, playing defense is that there's so many options that the offense can use. So you have to know how to play against each one of those, right? So if we're playing 4 sizings, we have to know how to play against 4 different sizings. So the best way to go about it, in my opinion, is first off, use the aggregator reports to find out what is the most common sizing the button is going to use. In this case, it's 33. And then first start there. And then go to the next common sizing, and then really see the difference between how to react against the different sizings. And then that being said, we're probably going to find some concepts where the difference between 33 and 50 isn't that large. So we end up just focusing on like looking at 33 and 75 or 33 and 125, right? So let's look at 33 first. And we can see here that big blind responds by continuing right here at this frequency. So they're calling 52%, raising 9.3 plus 4.6%. You can see we have 2 different raise sizes. We have 50% and 100%. And we're going to find some heuristics for whether to use the 50 or 100. But for the most part, using the 50 is going to be the more common sizing on a lot of board textures, as you can see here. But there are going to be specific board textures where raising 100 is the only sizing to use. And the way that we can start looking at that is filtering by the raise size here. So you can see, we'll start looking through this in a little bit. But for now, we're just going to focus on the overall stats, which is 52% call, a third of the time fold, and raise approximately 13.9% of the time, right? So 14% of the time, we're going to be check raising. Now, against the 33 sizing, the first thing that I notice is that we're using a lot of the 50% and a mix of the 100%. If we were to change the sizing that button uses, I think that's going to change the big blind's selection of which sizing to raise. So once we go larger, you notice that the raise size is now shoveled into the 50% sizing and a lot less of the 100% sizing. So already we can kind of assume that against the small sizing, we're going to use a raise that's a little bit of a larger sizing. And against the larger sizing, we're going to use the 50% raise more often. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody that's studied game theory, because when you're offering such a small price to the pot, Big Blind has a lot of incentive to inflate the pot larger with a lot of their hands. They want to reduce the SPR with a lot of their stronger hands. They want to be getting value from them, so the sizing goes larger. In order to size to get the money in by the river, you need to go larger early on in the first streets. So that's generally why you see the larger raise size against the smaller size bet. That being said, when villain uses a 125 sizing, you'll see that 100 is almost never used. And that's because you don't really need to be raising a large sizing in order to get your money in with the good hands. You also don't need to raise a large sizing to put your opponent in some tough scenarios as well. Like if you raise 50% versus the overbet, you're essentially, committing villain to a large played pot already, right? Because they already put in a lot of money. Now they need to call at a high frequency versus a raise because they're getting a good price. but it's tricky. It's really tricky. So the solver uses the 50% sizing. Maybe that was a little convoluted, but the main heuristic to take away from everything here is the smaller the sizing, the more often we implement the larger raise size, and the larger the c-bet, the less often we use the larger raise size. So how do we take that notes? Big blind versus button c-bet. So against 33%, big blind uses 100% sizing more frequent than versus larger sizing. More frequently than larger sizing. Okay. So these are just like the basics that we're taking away from the aggregated reports, right? We're not even diving into what combos, what board textures are good for raising, et cetera, et cetera. We're just looking at the overall strategy right now. And we've already devised that the raise size is going to be dictated by the button's c-bet size. So that helps you a lot in a couple of ways. One of the ways that it really helps is that if you know you need to be using a large raise size, then you just feel a lot more comfortable with like the stronger hands in your range to go larger, right? Sometimes players think like, oh, I have a really strong hand. I don't want them to fold. I should raise like, you know, medium to small. When in reality, like it's fine to be going large with a lot of your more polar range because that's what the solver is suggesting. As long as you're balanced, of course, in game. You have to go large with some uncomfortable, you know, weak hands as well. So we have the 50, we have the 100, we have the call, the fold. The overall strat is fairly simple against the small sizing. We use that size against the larger sizing, against larger, against I think even 75% and 125%. Higher frequency. Doesn't use 100%. Uses more 50%. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, now we would dive deep into which board textures are good for using larger sizings, right? So against against the button for the c-bet of 33%, let's look at what's our highest raise frequency, right? So it looks like 27.6. If we filter there, this is only 12.6. I have a feeling that this is going to be one of the highest raise frequencies we're going to have right here. And if we look on the left side, it happens to be a lot of paired boards with middling cards. Now, why is it that a lot of our check raises are going to come from paired boards with middling cards? Let's look at the ranges. So let's first look at the let's look at the 994 board and compare the different ranges. So button often bets small on this texture. Big blinds often raises on this texture. Why is that? Well, first of all, let's look at the equity buckets. What is our morphology from the big blind? It looks like we have a lot of weak hands, we have a lot of trash hands, and we really don't have that many good or best hands. So why is it that we're then check raising at a high frequency on a board like 994, right? I think in theory, it's difficult to find a lot of continues on board textures like this out of the big blind because we miss it so often. So we're often having to float a lot of like good and weak hands out of position. We're also even somewhat forced to float some trash hands at a frequency, I think. Let's see. Yeah, like we even sometimes are floating or check raising and turning our trash hands into a bluff. It's just the way that the way that our range is constructed, it looks like we're mostly forcing that trash hands, weak hands to be aggressive. Now, I'm not exactly sure why this is happening. I think I've read a couple of times. I've heard different theories about why this is happening, where we're check raising at a really high frequency, even though we don't have a lot of like the best hands advantage or the equity advantage. The one thing I've heard is that the solver looks to like defend a certain frequency, and there aren't a lot of hands that the solver wants to call with, right? Like it doesn't want to check call some of these weak, Jack 7 of diamonds hands. And instead it turns it into a check raise because of the playability on later streets. It has like backdoors and it has a lot of fold equity when check raising against a button that is also going to have a lot of air. So I think if I had to guess as to why we're check raising so often, it's because we don't have a bucket of calling that is really strong on these textures, right? We can't just float in position if we were in position. We're out of position, and it's a really awkward scenario with some of our weaker to trash hands. So you see like a lot of the calls are going to be obvious calls, like a 4 ace high, maybe some backdoor king high. And then the rest of these combos are just like, a small frequency of floating, like queen 10 of spades, something like jack 7 of clubs or whatever. But again, the solver really likes raising those combos, really likes raising queen 10 of hearts, likes to have a backdoor here, likes to, have some kind of backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw, maybe 2 overcards, a hand like, king 7, not really that valuable at first glance, but has 2 overs to a 4, has 2 overs to like a hand like pocket 6s, pocket 5s. That's going to see bet at a very high frequency from the button, right? So the way that the hands line up on this particular paired board, I think the solver tends to respond by raising more often than calling. And we can test this theory by looking at the call frequencies, right? So the call frequencies, you'll see, are directly correlated with whether or not we're raising. If we're calling at a very high frequency, we're not raising at a very high frequency. And so board textures where our ranges prefer to check call because we're going to have enough of those good hands, then it's easier for us to continue with a call. If we have a lot of weak and trash hands from the big blind here on these paired boards, like I was just saying, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to check call anymore because those hands aren't going to be able to have a lot of showdown value, et cetera, et cetera. They don't have the properties of the good hands that prefer calls. I think I'm kind of putting it together as I'm talking to you guys. I think that, the morphology of our range here on these paired boards is so that we have a lot of these trash and weak hands, like I was saying. And so the solver doesn't want to play those as a check call. It wants to play them as either a fold or a check raise and turn it into a bluff. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense now. Okay. So then if we were to look at another random board, like let's say, I don't know, 10, 7, 4. This is a board we might have a lot more good hands on right here, see? So this is a spot where, yes, we're going to have a raise frequency, but it's not going to be nearly as large as the paired board one where we don't have a lot of good hands to check call with. Okay, I think I figured it out. That is probably what it is. Sometimes I talk through the thing and I find the answer. But it takes me a little while because it's been a while since I've like studied theory and looked at the ranges and the morphology and everything like that. You said Twitch has a problem right now? Hmm. I think it's fine for me. Oh, I can't chat. Interesting. Let's see if yeah. Looks like Twitch is a little laggy right now. That's frustrating. Well, I think it's still working for me. It says I'm still streaming. So yeah, so we have that call frequency in the 1074 board, which explains why we're doing some more calling. So again, it's kind of like, how does your range morphology interact with the flop texture? So what kind of boards do we just have a lot of garbage on? I think a lot of the time it's going to be those paired boards, which makes a lot of sense for why we're raising on those paired boards specifically. That being said, there's another kind of board where I think we're going to have a high frequency of check raise, and that is going to be connected low cards that we have a decent amount of two pairs, and maybe we even have close to a similar best hands advantage on, right? So something like 754. This might be a good example. Board textures where we have a lot of strong hands that want to raise. Not only like, you know, we're going to have a lot of good hands, but we're also going to have a lot of best hands. And I think on these textures, it makes a lot of sense that we check raise, not so much for. Okay, no, I'm wrong. I think it's the same idea as the paired boards, although the good hands are much more prevalent. So you can see here, there's more calling incorporated. But when we have our weak and trash hands, we still have a lot of raises. So yeah, so something like Queen 6 still puts in a lot of check raises, but doesn't really like check calling, right? King 8, Jack 9 with a heart. So a lot of the trash hands that we would think about maybe folding, we can maybe start thinking about raising. That would actually help my aggression factor a lot. I'm definitely check folding way too much, not mixing in enough of these like check calls, check raises. This is a good learning process for me here too. Hmm. Interesting. Um, so big blind, check raises, on board textures. Big blind check raises, high frequency on board textures where continuing range has a lot of weak trash hands. that don't do well in check call bucket. I wonder if that's an overall heuristic. Back up. Um, Still not back up. Let's look at the Twitch front page. Yeah, it looks like it's down. We can go to Twitter and then look at Twitch here. Let's see if they're having issues. They haven't mentioned any issues. Oh well, I'm just gonna keep going. I'm just gonna keep going. Hopefully it isn't broken. So big blind check raises high frequency on board textures where the continuing range has a lot of weak trash hands that don't do well in the check call bucket. And has more of a polarized check raise range, I think, possibly. Let's look at the equity distribution. Of the 50 raise. This is just the raising hands. And we can see here we have hands like 4, 4, 5, 5 being green. And then we have some like light yellow. I don't think this is a polarized range necessarily. Because we have some hands like 8, 7 in there. Jack 5 is like not polarized at all. So I think it's not so much polarized. We'll take that out. But I do think still that hands like Jack 5 don't do well in the check call bucket, so the solver wants to start raising it sometimes because realizing equity out of position is already difficult. Add to the fact that you're having to now play on a board texture like this where any overcard is going to change the board significantly, any straight card, any heart. So it makes sense that like a hand like Jack 5 of spades, even though it has good equity, isn't going to play very well as a check call. I think it might be even, is it in the weak hands? No, this is in the good hands. Yeah, like I said, it's probably in the good hands because it has a lot of equity. But the playability and the equity realization is probably lower than normal. That would make sense. All right, moving on. So big blind check raises high frequency on board textures where the continuing range has a lot of weak trash hands that don't do well in the check call bucket. Also maybe on board textures where we have an equity advantage. Let's see. So the way we can find the equity advantage is by filtering the equity out of position. Here. So on board textures where we have high equity out of position, like this, that gives us an idea of whether or not we're raising based off of our equity and our advantages. You can see the big blind has some best hands, some good hands, a lot of weak hands. But overall, the equity is close with the button. So I don't think it's going to be that. I don't think this is really a high frequency raise. Let's try EV out of position. Again, it's very similar to the equity. Anything else I can think of that would cause a higher frequency in check raising? Well, looking at our check call range overall, 52%. Anytime it's dropping below 40, that's going to have a high percent of check raise. I think that's a really good heuristic to understand that, well, we don't want to continue very often, so maybe a check raise works here. And we need to find a lot of continues too out of position. So it's possible that the big blind isn't so much check raising on those advantages because it's not going to have a lot of range advantages, right? Flatting the button, it takes away a lot of really strong hands from the big blind. So it's really difficult for the big blind to ever really have those advantages. And it seems like if it does have those advantages, it does a lot of leading, right? We looked at the reports for leading. The times it leads a heavy frequency, like on 653, those are the times it does actually have the equity advantage and the best hands advantage. So when it does finally like hit a board that it really likes, it wants to lead a lot, which is really interesting to me, instead of check raise a lot. Because if we look at the board texture after we check and villain bets, okay, actually, yeah, this is a fairly high check raise frequency too. So this would track with what I was saying. There is maybe some board textures where we have a range advantage that would also attribute to the high check raise frequency. So we can put that in there too. Big blind check raises boards that it has range equity advantage, which isn't very many boards. So like example 653 rainbow. There aren't too many hands. So like let's look at 754. So by the same thought, this should be check raised at a high frequency when we're not leading. Yeah, great. That tracks. So the two different heuristics for check raising are particularly boards that our continuing range don't want to have a lot of check calls in them, and board textures where we have a range and equity advantage, perhaps. All right, I'm going to try to reload Twitch. Let's try and open the main page again. They must be having some issues. I'm surprised they haven't tweeted about anything yet. Well, that's frustrating. I'm sorry. Twitch is not behaving today. So big blind versus button C bet. You can bold that. Big button C betting, we can bold that. Button leading, we can bold that. Okay, so we've looked at some check raise scenarios, right? Of when to check raise. Now we can look at when to use the larger. Oh, we actually looked at the larger and smaller sizings, when to use the larger and smaller sizings as well. The other thing I've noticed is the solver uses the larger sizings on board textures that favor villain. So like on an ace 10 8 board, typically that favors the villain, right? But the big blind wants to check raise large on it. I think this is due to the polarized effect, where again, the big blind doesn't have a whole lot of hands it wants to check call, but it has a lot of really weak and trash hands and a lot of like, you know, 2-pair combos and sets that want to also check raise here. So like looking at the range on this board, you can see we have some like middling pairs. So it's, again, it's turning those like combos that don't really perform well across a couple of streets as a check call into a check raise semi bluff. This is something I just haven't been doing nearly enough out of the big blinds. I'm very unfamiliar with these lines, and I want to start adding them to my repertoire because all of these check raises are going to naturally increase our aggression factor. Like if we're playing these check raises correctly, like 10-9 offsuit, which I don't think a lot of players are doing, then that's going to really improve our big blind aggression. So using these like medium strength hands and weak hands as like check raises is very interesting to me. Like look at these good hands here, like 10-7 with backdoors. Usually the ones with the backdoors look like it's the ones that want to raise here. Like you don't see 10-6. You don't see 10-6 of spades there. Just the hearts and the clubs. So backdoor, like equity, middle pairs. I wonder, I'm just actually curious now, this is a little sidetracked, but I want to see, let's say we raise 10-5 suited, villain calls, turns like an offsuit or a suited 3, let's say. 10-5 is continuing to bet large with the clubs. Oh, oops, I made it the, let's make it, yeah. Still wants to do it more with the clubs than the hearts. I assume that's because it's blocking the ace 10 of clubs, whereas 10-5 is not blocking the ace 10 of hearts. Because the ace of hearts is on the board, right? What if the turn is a club? Now the hearts wants to pure check. And the club still continues at some frequency. All right, let's continue with the, I don't know, the heart. Now the hearts goes a little bit higher frequency and the club starts to check. All right, so let's put in the bet with the 10-5. Villain calls and river's like an offsuit deuce. Are we jamming 10-5? Are we turning this into a bluff? No. But perhaps we're like getting combos like queen jack and king queen to like fold turn that have equity against the 10. I don't know. It's an interesting play. Like a lot of our good hands by the river, or a lot of our good hands that were, yeah, a lot of our hands that were good on the flop are now weak hands on the river. And it looks like they generally don't want to be bluffed. We want to bluff, interestingly enough, even stronger hands that we might have had. I'm almost positive ace-7 is a bluff, but maybe it's not. It's in the good hands category. It looks like we would rather use the trash hands as a bluff. So interesting. So like if we shove river, villain has to call with a lot of worse hands than a7 maybe? Yeah, they have to call with all of these 10x combos. Jack 10, Queen 10, King 10. That's surprising. So yeah, I think maybe the a7 is value. That's pretty wild. I'm not doing that nearly enough. I mean, it's a very low frequency that it's happening. You're better off just sticking to more, you know, obvious hands like ace 8 and ace 10 and whatever for value, 10 8. But these merges are really cool. I'm going to try and incorporate those into different scenarios. Okay, so big blind versus button c-bet. We're now like really kind of getting off topic a little bit, but I really like diving into some of those scenarios because that's how I learn personally. But looking forward, so we looked at the 33%. Now we would look at the 50 and 75% and compare how that affects the not only frequency of the raising, but also the like construction of the raising, right? Like looking at the ace 10 8, we're potting against a small bet with a lot of interesting hands that I wouldn't have thought were a check raise prior, right? But maybe against the 33, we're not doing that as much. Maybe if the villain, or I mean, sorry, not the 33, but the 75. Maybe if they use the 75 or the large sizing, which is totally in their repertoire, right? How does that affect a lot of our hands now? Are we still check raising the 10-5, the 10-4? It looks like we are. We're doing maybe a lot more folding now, though. Starting to understand I'm not check raising enough out of position in general. I think that there's this theory that I've been calling maybe too much with my weak and trash hands. More so my weak hands. It looks like a lot of weak hands want to check raise out of position, which is a fundamental kind of concept, which I've maybe overlooked a bit. So yeah, so here's the check raise now. A7, still a little small frequency in there, but yeah. The 100% sizing is now used a lot less. The 50% sizing is starting to get incorporated, right? So there's that idea of against the larger sizing, we start using the 50% instead of the 100. Oops. So yeah. So what have I learned about big blind versus button today? When to check raise. Because usually when you check raise, then you don't have to worry about the check calling. It kind of falls into place. When you realize what hands you're supposed to check raise at a frequency, then you're also probably supposed to check call those at a frequency, and you can kind of get an idea of like, okay, this hand just always plays better as a check call. But maybe we should look into it a little bit more. So let's look at a spot like now, like what are the good check call hands on ace 10 8? Well, looks like a lot of these ace X combos, top pairs, are really good for check calling. A lot of the good hands, right? So a lot of mid pairs, a lot of top pairs. These are the most obvious combos for check calling because they don't want to check raise for 3 streets. They don't want to, they just want to realize their equity, it looks like. So along with the check raises with the 10-5, 10-5 is also a really good check call, right? But then you look at the weak hands, much fewer, you know, obvious combos for check calling here, but still bottom pair, some straight draws, some gut shots. Actually, that is pretty intuitive, I think. Nothing way out of line. And then the trash hands mostly aren't calling. They're mostly folding or raising. So you see like some of the weakest floats are like gut shots like Jack 7, 9, 6, 7, 6. But you're not just like floating King 4 high, right? Like that's just not really a thing. You're just folding those combos. So looking at like the fold combos, you're just folding those like King high disconnected, Queen high disconnected, Jack high disconnected on these board textures. And yeah, it's interesting. All right, let's try and refresh Twitch. Still broken. Sag. You hate to see it. So again, just check calling. Good hands. Check raising. Mix of weak hands. Good hands. Best hands. And there you go. So now to practice all of what we just put into, into our notepad, I'm going to go to the trainer. We're going to go to a custom spot where button raises, big blind calls, flop is X, big blind checks, and now the button is going to do something. Let's study the 33% first. C-bet. All right, so right away, interesting hand. I would classify this hand as a weak hand. It's king high, but it has backdoor potential. This board texture is pretty good for us. I could see this being a mixture of check raise and perhaps check call. But again, the solver doesn't really like check calling these spots, so maybe it's a mix of check fold and check raise. Right? Like if this is a trash hand, it goes in the fold column. But if this is a weak hand, then we could perhaps check raise this or check call at a decent frequency. I think I'm going to do what I just said and check call or check fold at, check call or check raise. I think those are going to be my two options. And if I were to raise, I would go 50%. Okay, so it looks like it's mostly going to be check call, but there is that, EV is pretty high for raise 50% as well. You can see the difference between call and raise is almost the same. So you couldn't go too wrong by raising, but more so the solver maybe rather have something like king 5 or king 3 instead for the check raises. Ace queen 8, ace queen jack. This is a board that favors button. I think in theory, if we were to raise, we would want to raise large. This is a good board to raise on with this hand. So I think I'm going to go raise 100. I could have also gone raise 50, but yeah, raise 50 was the more common. Maybe on a board like this, we don't have to raise as large as often on a connected board. Maybe it plays to the same idea as like a monotone board where the nuts isn't going to change very often on turn river. So yeah. 4-3 suited, this is an interesting one. I think this would go into our weak hands. I think we can probably mix a check raise. I think we're gonna mix between call and raise. Gonna call this time with a 50 RNG roll. So yeah, we can just mix between raise 50, raise 100, and call. It doesn't look like the solver particularly wants to use a 50 or 100 more or less, but the 50 is the more common size to use. Interesting. Queen 7-2. It's actually pretty cool. We've had a lot of different hands that we want to raise on the flop already. In Queen 7-2, I think this is a texture that will have a lot of air. We can probably check raise this for value at a mix. This is pretty high up in our range. Is this a texture we want to do a lot of check raising on, though? I mean, probably. Let's do call this time. Yeah, we can also check raise. So here's a good example of floating like bear king high. I was just mentioning before, like on the ace 10x board, didn't make a lot of sense. Here, it's a little bit more valuable in that we have like 2 cards over the 8. I typically want to check call this spot. I could check raise maybe. I'm going to check call, but this could be a check fold. This could be in our trash category. This might be a little bit too wide. Nope, call is good. So this hand, I think we can mix between check raise and check call. If we are going to raise, I'm going to go raise 100 because this is a board texture that hits villain well. We want to be fairly polarized with our raising range. Let's try it. Nice. So yeah, mix between 150, but 100 is the most common sizing. 9-8. Okay, so this is cool because this we were kind of looking at is similar to the ace 10 combo. Maybe there's some check raises here with 9-8. I think that I'd rather have the diamonds or the spades to do the check raising. So I'm going to check call this time. But yeah, see the EV here? It's actually fairly high for check raise. We can also check the... can also check here, 9-8 suited, and we can see that the spades and the diamonds do in fact start mixing in a check raise. So really cool, something I'm learning here, turning some of these weaker hands into a check raise on flops and stuff. If I did check raise, let's say I check raise the spades combo, villain calls, turns a 3 of hearts. Are we going to barrel 9-8? No, we're mostly checking. What if the turn is a spade? Then we're starting to bet 50. Interesting. Interesting that we have the 50% sizing. I haven't typically used the 50% sizing after check raising. I more or less use the 125, but it looks like the 50% sizing is kind of the merge ranges, right? Like King Jack, and then some weaker hands. Jack 8 of spades mixes in there. So yeah, so more or less it looks like the it's like the bet 50 has a lot of that mediocre value. King 9, King 10, actually not King 9, sorry, King 10. Some gutters, low pocket pairs, bottom pair. They do share a lot of combos with the overbet, but particularly King Jack, King Queen, King 10, they all want to bet 50. All right, 992. This is a great board for us to check raise for continuing, but this is not a good hand, so we're just going to fold. Ace-8 suited. This is a good hand to check raise, I assume. A lot of equity. Would probably go for the 50 or 100 sizing at a mix. Probably a high frequency check raise. We do need to call though. Do I raise this 30% of the time? Or sorry, 70% of the time? I think that's a little high for raising, so I'm going to call this time. Oh, wow. We actually do a lot of calling. Okay. So interesting. Why is it that we're just calling a very strong suited ace here? It looks like ace-8 and ace-9 particularly prefer call. And then something like ace-7, ace-6, ace-4, ace-2 have a higher frequency. So maybe that's because ace-8 and ace-9 just play better as a check call with the backdoor straight draw combo. That's very possible. King 10. So this is a good board for check raising. This hand, I think, is, if we were to continue with it, a check call more than a raise, but I think fold is going to be the most common frequency play. Nope, we can, in fact, call a lot. Okay. Interesting. So here, now this makes more sense for me to check raise. I think we can use the 100 or the 50 sizing. Let's go for the 50 sizing. Dang, not raising at all. That's the second time we raised a flush draw where we should have called. So the solver does prefer the 100 sizing on this board texture. But why is Jack 6 such a high frequency call and then Jack 5 suited is a high frequency raise? What is the difference here? Why is this 6 so important to check call with? Maybe it's just the best, worst flush draw? Like Queen 6 check raises. Why is Jack 6 not check raising? King 6 check raises. All of the 6x's except for Jack 6 specifically doesn't want to check raise. Ugh. Sometimes the solver is just difficult. Just to be difficult, you know? How is a 6 important on this texture? I don't know. Just gonna fold here. All right, I'm gonna play a couple more and then I'm gonna get into playing. Queen 5-4, we can mix a check raise, I think. It has the backdoor flush draw. That's good for check raising, right? We have even the backdoor straight draw. Let's go for the raise 100. Dang, raise 50 would have been the choice on this particular texture. Makes sense. But raise 100 is also good. Queen 10-2. Fold. All right, let's look at the two hands we got inaccuracies on. One was the 5-2 suited. If I was to play this through, I'm kind of curious about playing it through. If I was to play this through, let's say we go for the check raise, fill in calls, turn is, let's just do a randomized turn. So that's a spade. I think the solver would like to continue betting. Nope, mostly wants to check, so totally wrong. I guess it becomes a good check call with that combo. 5-2, yeah, that makes 2 pairs, so that's going to continue betting. A 6, interesting. It looks like 5-2 is mostly checking. It looks like 5-2 is mostly checking. Let's give it like a 9 of spades. If a spade comes, it influences betting more. But like if a 9 of diamonds comes, I think it's going to check a lot. Yeah, unless it has the diamonds. So those medium or good hands that check raise flop, they typically aren't firing the turn unless they pick up equity, it seems. All right. Let's get out of here. What should I write down? So check raising good hands with backdoors that don't play well out of position. All right, we're gonna tweak this as we go on, but I think that's some good stuff